I'd like to thank our forum sponsors for their support: InCrowd, Schlesinger Group, Shapiro and Raj, and Survey Healthcare. So welcome back to day 3. I'm Heidi Boyle. I'm the Director of Education here at Intellus, and I'm going to share some notes while we're getting everybody logged in and getting ready for our Global Low Incidence Studies guidance from our new Intellus Low Incidence think tank. So each of these sessions are made up of 2 parts. I'm sure most of you are aware of this by now. First, we're going to have the Zoom web broadcast, and then we will join smaller breakout discussion groups via a separate meeting room link. And I'm going to post the registration link here in case you haven't done it yet. You can go ahead and do it while we're broadcasting. If you have any technical issues, submit them in the chat, and I will try to assist you. We have saved time at the end for questions. You can submit them through the Q&A, and a lot of people have been submitting them through the chat, and I'll be watching that as well. Once the session concludes, you're going to go to your individual link that was sent from the Zoom meeting to go into your breakout group discussions. We will be sending out the slides after the webinar, and if you miss any portion or want to recommend this to a colleague, it's going to be available on demand in our virtual learning center in a couple of days. Our speakers today are Amanda Chalmers from ZS Associates, Matt Walmsley from Survey Healthcare Globus, Jana Rueten-Budde from M3 Global Research, and Brian Sharkley with Putnam Associates. Amanda, I think you're first up. You want to take it away?
Certainly. Thank you, Heidi. So our discussion today, we're going to start with a brief intro looking at the recruiting funnel. Then we'll talk about what to do before a project starts, during the design phase, and post. So I will kick us off with the recruiting funnel. So as I mentioned, we're going to frame today's discussion using the concept of the recruiting funnel. So the idea is you have this whole universe of potential respondents out there. But then it gets cut down by, well, how many of those are actually enrolled in a panel? And then from there, how many of them are actually active? Of those who are active, how many are interested in your study? And then of those interested, how many actually qualify when they take the screener? And that's how we get to feasible sample size. So this is what we're going to talk about today. And I think we need to start by acknowledging that feasible sample size is jointly controlled by the recruiter and the insights company. We need to work together on this. The recruiter has a little more control in the top, right? They're the ones building the panel, so they know who's enrolled in their panel, and they probably have a pretty good idea of who's active on their panel. The insights company, we're the ones designing the survey, right? So we can usually control a little bit who's interested in the study. For example, we know physicians are much more interested in a 20-minute study than a 45-minute study. And obviously paying a healthy honoraria helps. So we can help control this, who's interested in the study. And then of course, there's incident rate. And that's how many people pass our screener. But that's what we're going to spend way more time talking about today. I think one more thing we need to acknowledge is the feedback loop. Panelists who have a poor experience, by that I mean repeatedly screening out, especially on a long screener, ultimately become inactive. So although, say, the insights company is controlling the incidence rate, ultimately that feeds back, and that may lead to inactive panelists. And the recruiting companies and insights companies were always working together. So, I mean, if the insights company is constantly sending through these crazy low IR studies, and I'm with an insights company, I'm guilty of that. It's actually just hurting my recruiting partners, and that's going to end up hurting me again because I need to come back to them for sample. So the topic of today's webinar, low incidence studies. So let's get super clear with what that means. So IR is incidence rate, and that is the percent of respondents who pass the screening criteria. And why is it so important? So let's visually imagine that the IR is 80%. So everyone who's interested in the study and clicks on my screener, 80% of people pass it. So visually, this is the number of people who would qualify. But what if I cut that in half? What if only exactly 40% screen in instead of 80%? That exactly cuts my feasible sample size in half. And that's why it's so important. So how should we define IR? So as we said in words already, right? IR is incidence rate. That's the percent of respondents who pass the screening criteria. Sounds pretty clear, but actually not quite. We need to get even more detailed than that. And I'm going to use an equation for that. So specifically, IR is the respondents who qualify divided by the respondents who qualify and do not qualify. So question for you folks, what is the problem or confusion with this statement? Let's say I go to my recruiting partner and say, I'm running a study about HER2 positive breast cancer and need to recruit oncologists. I expect the IR to be 60%. I've stated my IR. I said this equation is going to be 60%. What I need to do, though, is actually define who's included in this equation, who's in my denominator. So 60% of which group? Is it 60% of all oncologists who qualify? Or is it 60% of oncologists who treat breast cancer who qualify? That's a very different thing, right? If it's only 60% of oncologists who treat breast cancer on the base of all oncologists, that might only be 40% or less. So if we're not totally clear between the recruiting partner and the insights company on when we're talking about IR, what that actually means, and whether the recruiting partner can actually target so specifically who I want, then we're already off to a bad start. So we've defined IR in general. We've talked a little bit about why it matters, but even more on why it matters. Let's talk about the difference between predicted IR, which is during study design, we actually don't know what the IR is going to be, right? We take our best guess. Best practice here would be obviously for the insights company to provide the recruiter a screener or at least an outline of it so that the recruiter can estimate IR more accurately instead of doing, I mean, we all know that the go-to is 70%, and we know that's usually not the case. That's why we're here today. Then there's actual IR. So what does it actually come out to be once we're in field? And I think we all have felt this. Why is it bad when actual IR is less than predicted IR? Well, our recruiting partner has based their timeline, feasibility, and price on the IR assumption. And if it comes in much worse, then both the recruiter and insights company are scrambling to hit the end size. So a few quick tips. Make sure you have a plan before launching. Review the soft launch data. This is a super useful early read on IR, and be prepared to make changes prior to full launch. Know upfront when you're going to make changes. Will your client pre-approve any changes? Which screening criteria can you soften first? And for target list studies, which parts of the list do you open up when can you go off list? Second, bring on another recruiter. Have a pre-agreed milestone with your recruiter on when to bring on another one, assuming IR is what it's supposed to be. Now, if it drops, that's a separate thing. But if we've estimated it correctly and the sample still isn't coming in, we should be partnering. I mean, sometimes we can extend timelines and lower sample. And this is something I think on the insight side, if we're socializing this with our clients early, they understand. So if we know like kind of what is the drop dead date for closing fielding and what is the smallest end size we can get to actually get the insights we need, we can use that. And of course, relax screening criteria. And I'd say this is a last resort because then you need to re-invite respondents and they may not always want to come back because they're kind of upset that they took your screener and you didn't invite them the first time. One note, I know sometimes we raise honoraria for a lot of reasons. I think we all know that that's not recommended, right? It trains our respondents to have a bad behavior of, I've heard it described as enriched for waiting. So some respondents will actually wait for the second invite to come with a higher honoraria. So that's not great, but the second part that's not great is that a lot of our clients may have very strict fair market value guidelines. So if we start raising honoraria and forget to check back, we might go over those and that puts us all in hot water. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Matt, who's going to talk about what to do pre-project.
All right. Well, thank you, Amanda, for your great insight. My name is Matt Walmsley, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at SHG. My section of this presentation is going to speak about what you can do pre-field to set up for success. You will see at times where my section may not be purely focused on low incidence, but contain general best practice with a dash of incidence. In essence, these pre-field recommendations are, as in understanding the effect of incidence, ways to ensure success for your market research project. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is knowing your universe and its effect. One of the biggest issues that I encounter when I talk with my team and the stakeholders in the industry is around understanding the effect of the raw population numbers on your research specifications. You will see on the right of the screen a nice image that I enjoy sharing that shows proper context when comparing the US to the major EU markets by raw population sizes. You can visually see the sizes of the major EU markets within the context of the US. And as they say, picture's worth 1,000 words. To further highlight how raw population matters, I will compare US to the UK. I do this since it's the easiest linkage given the commonality of language, as well as the lineage with the US itself. You will see the huge difference in population between the US and the UK. The US is nearly 5x the total population than its English-speaking forefathers. So the question I pose, is it reasonable to assume that a UK physician would see the same number of patients as their US counterpart? In some cases, perhaps, but generally speaking, it's not reasonable to apply a US patient load to the UK and or the EU4 given the major discrepancy in raw population. There's never a good rule. It's always knowing kind of your sector, your expertise. But generally, I recommend looking at 30%. So if your incidence in the U.S. is holding, I would recommend dropping your incidence for outside the U.S. by 30%. So what does that mean? If in the U.S. it's 15 patients, it means go to 10 patients in the EU5. Obviously, in some cases, we can't just do this without any data or pre-field. But again, as Amanda mentioned before, socializing some of these issues or talking about this beforehand will allow the discussion to be a bit easier when you get into the trenches and things are going askew for you. There'll be a bit more around these points later on in the presentation that Jana will be discussing. In the end, the key takeaway here is to know your raw population of the market when evaluating how your screener sample should be composed. Perfect. The next part is talking about the universe with the healthcare professional focus. This is my favorite and least favorite actual use case. I get this basically 3 times a month, if not weekly. Why can't I get 100 oncs in Canada? Canada is massive. I mean, technically you're correct. Canada is the second largest landmass in the world, but the raw Canadian population is only 37.5 million. Or to put it into a US context, still almost 20 million less people in raw population than the smallest region in the United States. Smallest region is the Northeast region too. So even think about that even further. To further compound this issue, when you look at the MD universe, the discrepancy is even greater. For example, according to the CMA, which is basically the equivalent to the AMA in Canada, there are only 625 oncologists in all of Canada. So Matt, what are you saying I should do? What I recommend is using a very powerful tool called the 20-to-1 rule when trying to ascertain what is a reasonable deliverable sample size per market. So how does this 20-to-1 rule work? Basically, the rule works by taking the universe of potential respondents, multiplied by your incidence, and divide by 20 to understand what could be a reasonable sample size for your market research project. So where does this rule of thumb come from? It basically comes from an old non-panel-based universe recruitment methodology that utilizes custom telephone recruitment. What this says is that for every 25 qualified respondents that you talk to on the phone, you'll be able to recruit one of them for your market research survey. The big disclaimer here is that this is a general rule of thumb for guidance to set expectations and understanding. Talking with your recruitment agency partners and local experts is the best way to provide other avenues to deliver a higher sample size. The key thing here is, I mentioned Canada here in my example, but this rule is universally applicable. And I'll show this on my next slide with actual numbers and use case with a typical global research request. So again, the key takeaway here is to leverage the power of the 21 rule of thumb to guide your sample expectations. So here we go. Let's see the 21 rule into action. There's a lot on this screen and I love it a lot. I'm specifically looking at oncology in the US, Canada, EU5, and we'll see where we net out. Before we review the results, let's discuss them and level set for how the formula works. Again, the formula used to create this chart is the universe of potential respondents, as Amanda defined earlier, multiplied by your incidence and divided by your record to recruit ratio. So in this case, 20, or the rule of thumb 20. In the example below, I run this for an 80% incidence and also a 30% incidence to show you what the incidence can do to your sample. Below in the chart, you'll see estimated universes for each market that was generated from the AMA in the States, CMA in Canada, and then a combination of the ephemera Dr. Stats report, CIA Factbook, and the WHO for EU5. There'll be a bit more about this in a second, but it's a little more complex in the EU5 than in the US and Canada. But looking at the actual numbers based on the universe available, you'll see that getting 100 oncs in Canada is a pipe dream, given the low universe available to sample against after applying your incidence and the 20-to-1 rule. To further compound the sample size issue, look at what a lower incidence does as well. You go from a sample of 25 to only 9 possible at the lower incidence. I know selling a quant study to your stakeholders with a sample size of 9 completes could be slightly a tough sell, but knowing your universe, your potential respondents, will allow you to have informed discussions with your teams and allow you to discuss screening flexibility in an informed way. This is why we have to make it at least 50% so we can get your sample size so it's readable for your quant research. Furthermore, you'll see how the raw universe size can affect more than just Canada and how it could affect the other European markets. I know there will be a lot of people in this webinar that says, hey, Matt, hey, task force, we just got 75 completes in Spain last week. Why are you saying you can only do 32 right here? The major reason for this, as I kind of alluded to before, is that universe counts outside of the US is a little bit tough to get wrapped around. And that's where the local expertise comes into play. There's definitely other people you can target, or technically speaking, there's definitely probably more than 803 oncologists in Spain. So using that local expertise of your recruitment teams is the way to get more completes and why we can deliver more for you and the industry across the board. The 20-to-1 ratio is looking to empower those who are doing research to have a further grasp on what is achievable using this quick guidance. Again, utilizing your research agency partners will allow you to maximize your sample size, utilizing the strength of their panel, their category expertise, and recruitment expertise. So the major takeaway here is do not assume an N size across geos without context of the universe of potential respondents. All right, next up is talking about localization. This is an area that Jana will cover a bit more later, but I want to provide some pre-field considerations around localization. My key example is chips. In the States, this is a fried potato chip, where in the UK, this is a French fry, where our UK call the former a crisp. Remember, the US grew up from UK. They're our forefathers, and we're two English markets. And there still is a very clear cultural distinction, even around the simple subject of a French fry. Considering different cultures is a key item you want to do before you write your questionnaire. In some EU markets, asking ethnicity is not always appropriate, and you need to either not ask it. In France, for example, it's not recommended, or provide proper and respectful opt-out. Another example, of localization is in Germany, where a lot of MDs are technically internal medicine doctors. And in Germany, respondents can be very direct when you ask them a question. So you may need to include subspecialty and/or behavioral screening to hit your target in your research. Another big cultural nuance that comes up all the time is oncologists in Japan. Sure, there are some oncologists in Japan, and it is a growing specialty, but generally speaking, cancer is treated by the physician who treats the part of the body that's inflicted by the cancer. So lung cancer, for example, a pulmonologist or a respirologist would be treating that. The last item around localization, it's the most famous localization story that I know, or perhaps an urban legend, depending on who you talk to, is around the infamous Chevy Nova. Tangentially, it's a great car. I loved it. It was one of my first cars, personally. But the legend goes that Chevy rolled out the Nova brand in Latin America and immediately got unexpected sales results. Very little results, to be precise. What was learned is that the team, upon rollout, did not consider localization with the brand name of Nova, which translated means doesn't go. So trying to sell a consumer a car that doesn't go is probably a hard sell, definitely for sure. So the key takeaway here is, applying American settings practiced globally can cause you to miss the mark on your research and cause more harm than good across the board. Finally, I just wanted to talk about a little bit more around patients and items for patients to consider pre-field. One of the biggest mistakes I see is how a pharma brand would want to target and how general consumer panels are actually screened. Usually there is a disconnect. Pharma brands are generally looking for those that are diagnosed, where most general online consumer panels only screen via do you suffer from, or perhaps even only screen on the fly using a GenPop sample. The key point here is to understand what, as Amanda noted before with the HER2 example, what the incidence is based on and getting consensus around this before fielding. Understanding the role of prevalence is also a big item here. Again, it goes back to the whole know your universe. My example is looking at migraines versus epilepsy. Again, I'm not a trained statistician. I just Googled these numbers, so I'll leave it at that. Illustration only, please. But when I Googled it, 22% of the population suffer from migraines, about 6.3 with epilepsy. So akin to the previous example, you'll see what the reasonable sample sizes would be for the two audiences is very different, and it's driven by those available universe of each disease, hence by the prevalence itself. In the chart, I focused on US UK to understand what could be achievable in each market and showing the effect incidence has on two different diseases, where a 30% incidence amongst migraine should be fine to give you a reasonable sample size. However, with epilepsy, likely not the case. A much harder task to deliver. Getting a readable sample size for a quant of 20 may not be, may not be an easy sell for a lot of the stakeholders on this call today. Again, these numbers are best practice guidance. It's meant for illustration purposes. So the best way to make sure you're successful is to talk with your teams, get a consensus with everyone involved, and utilize the specialization expertise of recruiting agencies, insights firms to ensure a successful market research project. The last item for me today is talking around, best practice on when you can use GenPop or use caregivers. These two tactics recruiting companies use quite a bit. In our example, using GenPop for migraines would be something that I would advise and think you could do and get some good extra completes from. Using GenPop for epilepsy, not really going to do much for you given the prevalence stuff. So it's not a best practice to do it. Conversely, with caregivers, bringing caregivers in for migraines, again, it gets you some sample, but is that really worth your while? Where epilepsy, a more debilitating disease, using caregivers may help you get a higher sample size and greater insights for your research. So again, in the end here, key takeaways is prevalence matters, as well as getting consensus on what the incidence is based on. Targeted sample, GenPop, or a mixture of the two. I'm going to pass it now on to Jana to discuss best practice around the design phase. So Jana, please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matt. So now we are at the stage where we've done the groundwork, we have thought about our target, we've thought about localization of specialties and setting, and now we're at the point where we can actually put pen to paper and start with some actual screener design. So we're going to talk about 4 different steps in screener design that we should be paying attention to. The first step is to carefully consider what questions you actually want to include. The second step, include what is important and order it accordingly. The third step, test your screener if that is at all possible for your study. The fourth step, react to the challenges which may actually be findings from your testing phase. And then the hypothetical step 5 is, of course, to successfully field your project. So starting with the first step, what should you be including in your screener? And the very first thing that's very clear, your screener should establish respondents' consent to participate. And that can be really quite straightforward or sometimes a bit more intricate. And it really just depends on what you want or need respondents to consent to in a particular study. So that can depend on your methodology. If you're conducting a qual study where you have observers being present, you want to record the session, etc., you need quite a lot of consent questions. On the quantitative side, you may need to get consent from respondents to download a particular app or to process their IP address, for example. So that can already give you a couple of questions that should be asked at the start. But then other than consent, what else should you be including in your screener? And on this, the industry guidelines globally really agree that a screener is there to determine if a respondent is eligible for a survey, and it's not a data collection tool and shouldn't be seen as almost a mini survey that respondents are not being compensated for. This means that all of the questions that you have in your screener should terminate respondents if either they don't fit a criterion or they don't fit into any of the open quotas. When we're talking about quotas, if you do include them, it can be really advisable to include ranges in them right from the start, so that at the end of fieldwork, you're not stuck looking for the unicorn respondent that we're going to be talking a little bit more later on. Now, on the flip side, what should not be included in your screener, and you should exclude any information-only question that just serve a data collection purpose. Demographic questions, that's something that can most of the time be actually placed into the main survey. Or this is also a great point in time to cut out any questions that at the end of the day are not going to be necessary for your analysis. For example, asking respondents if they took part in an MR survey in the past year. If you don't need that info for your analysis and it's not required, it's best to streamline at that point and just remove it. Right, okay, so at this place, I want to take a small detour and tag on to what Matt discussed earlier about how globally markets can differ quite significantly. And this can include the setup of medical specialties themselves, and it can also include their individual responsibilities, their settings, or even actually whole treatment pathways that may differ between countries. Or it can also be a case for some diseases, in particular rare ones, that they may be treated by multidisciplinary teams. And because of this, what we generally recommend is that you screen on function rather than specialty. And this is something that on the one hand can help your fieldwork and prevent any screening out of those respondents that are those that you actually want to be talking to. But on the other hand, rather than just preventing challenges, that approach of screening on function can also give you really valuable insights into how different markets are working. And I want to give you a little example of that. I vividly recall a project that I worked on where we were looking for doctors working in the emergency room. So the screener was set up to only allow doctors with a specialty of emergency physician, and they had to spend 90+% of their time in the emergency room. And in some markets that worked really brilliantly, US could complete very quickly, but in some markets, particularly in Germany and France, we got really stuck. And so what we then learned is that in these markets, the emergency doctors are actually out in the field if there is a serious cause, such as a suspected stroke or heart attack. And so they are not in the emergency room all the time. And that was a really good finding. And in the end, the specialty question was fully opened. But if we had opened that from the start, we would have still obtained the same findings, but we would have avoided a delay in fieldwork. So we're really making a strong recommendation to screen on function rather than title where that is possible. Okay, so now on to step 2. You have now decided what to include in your screener. You've decided to move anything that's just a nice to have into the main survey or discussion guide. So what you now need to do is decide what order to ask those questions in. What is advisable here is to ask key questions as early as you reasonably can. There are always going to be some questions where there can be flexibility down the road, but some criteria are just going to be hard. If you are doing research on a specific product and the respondent just has never heard of that product, they're very, very unlikely to ever qualify. And screening out is never a great experience for respondents, so we really want to avoid making it even harder by asking them more and more questions when we already know they are just never going to qualify. Another great thing to do at this point is to triage your questions and looking at where there can be flexibility, if you really, really need to, and where there just can be no flexibility at all. And this comes down to what Amanda mentioned earlier as well. It's a great tool to have if you think about future challenges later on in fields in terms of AR, because then you already have the foresight and you have a game plan already mapped out. Okay, then on to step 3, which is testing of your screener. So testing in the form of pilot interviews, for example, is really brilliant, but it really depends on the project-specific budget and timelines if they allow for that, especially if you are fielding in multiple markets and have to take into account all the translations, setting up of fieldwork appointments, etc. But there are also other ways in which you can test your screener that are really easy wins. And the first thing that you can do, which we have set throughout, is to seek input from your fieldwork provider who may be able to provide feedback based on their own experience. So if I draw back to the example that I mentioned earlier about emergency doctors in Germany not being in the emergency room all the time, that's something that I've definitely fed back on a lot of studies. I'm never going to forget that. So another easy win that you really should always be doing is to soft launch your study, which Brian is going to be talking about in a little bit. Okay, so on to step 4, we're almost there. Step 4 is that if you see a challenge, during testing or maybe once you go into field, strive to react right away. And you have already done the hard work. You've already triaged your screener in step 2. So you already have plans, and now is really the time to put them in motion. And in that, you should be keeping both screening criteria and quotas in mind at this point. So I have seen studies where the bulk of over 90% of fieldwork was completed in a week, and then the last few respondents took significantly longer to complete because you needed those elusive respondents that just perfectly fit into all of those remaining quota slots. And that's what we then call the unicorn respondent. Okay, so we have spoken about the 4 steps that should be followed, but why are we bothering with all the hassle? Why are we going through all of this? And it's really twofold. The first thing that doing this does is, if you do the due diligence, it's going to help your own project. So you know what challenges are going to expect, it reduces uncertainties, and it avoids having to improvise later on in field when stress levels may be higher as well. But then you are not only helping your current study, but you're actually helping future market research as well. As we referenced earlier, if a respondent is first recruited to take part in market research and they become an active participant, and then they really frustratingly screen out in their first couple of MI experiences, they're very unlikely to ever come back. So screening out is really a necessary evil, but we can do our part to not make it more painful than it really has to be. Okay, then we have some more general tips that also feed into this. The first one is, as a rule of thumb, don't make your screener too long. So that's a really obvious one. Where possible, you should try to limit it to under 10 questions, because you have to keep in mind that they may already have had to go through a number of consent questions to get to that point. Then we're continuing to repeat this because it's a very important point. Look to speak to your local recruiter, and that is just something that we really recommend to get that expertise. Then we have time and patient care. So different cutoffs for different markets may be useful, but actually, if your respondent is treating enough patients and they're treating the right patients, thus time and patient care actually matter at that point. And it's similar with years in practice. Firstly, the number of years in practice, it is changing over time as we're seeing populations aging. So it is worth having a think if this is something that is really needed for your project. And lastly, asking for a typical month rather than last month when asking about patient numbers. So treatment patterns may be changing over time, or maybe in the last month, the respondent happened to be on holiday. So let's make questions easy for doctors to answer, and it's best to go with a typical month. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand over to Brian.
Thank you, Jana. And I will walk us through what our approach needs to be once we do get into field. The first thing I want to call out is something that my peers here have called out, but I want to reiterate it because it's often lost as soon as we get into the project and we are blinded by immediate project needs. So those levers that we're constantly thinking about pulling or trading off of budget or timeline, sample size, perhaps it's our methodology or our LOI. These are all things which are very top of mind for researchers as we're running a project. What is not so top of mind is sort of those future projects. I'm sure everyone who is on this call today is not in the business of selling one research project. The oncologists who we are screening out this week, we want to be speaking to next week on our next project. And so since you're all very smart folks and have signed up for this webinar, you know this already, but I do think it's important to reiterate, even for research veterans, because it's so easy to forget about all those best laid plans once we are in the field. Something that Jana touched on briefly, but what I want to discuss in a bit more depth is the importance of soft launch and using it as a tool, not just to help you recruit, but to help really address those IR issues before they wear out and erode the health of the overall health of the panel. Something I've seen with some novice researchers is using a soft launch data just to make sure everything is quote unquote working. A veteran researcher such as yourself and everyone here is surely thinking beyond that and making sure we're getting the most use out of our soft launch data. and specifically as it relates to IR. When thinking about IR, we also need to be thinking not just of overall IR, but are there things that we can be looking at within key quota groups? So if there are hard quotas you have, make sure you're examining and analyzing IR on those as well. And then certainly looking at where respondents being screened out, where are they dropping out? What is causing our IR to drop? This is really the big question you should be asking. And as it was pointed out earlier, we should have a plan by the time we're in field to address these IR issues. So we know which questions we can be flexible on. We should know about at what range IR is going to be an issue. And now that we're in field, this is when we get to put that plan in place. Something we always like to recommend too is review your IR data with your fieldwork partners. Sometimes there are things that we see as a research or consulting agency, or perhaps things that we don't see that our partners do, and will be able to give us a much better feedback as to whether or not changing a piece of screening criteria will actually impact IR or not. And then finally, if you do make edits to the screening criteria, you've analyzed your data and you've determined, okay, these are the screening questions that we need to be a bit more flexible on. Only make those edits, or do make those edits before proceeding with the full launch. And certainly the reason being is we want to minimize the amount of re-invitations that will need to be sent out. So quick recap of the overall benefits of a soft launch. It identifies those IR issues before you burn through too much sample. It provides you with data-driven recommendations that you can bring back to the client. I know I've had more than a few instances where a client insisted the patient threshold needed to be X, and it comes back and the data shows us that X is way too high. That is a nice, gentle way of saying, I told you so to our clients, perhaps, and giving them data-driven insights. And then, like as I mentioned, it decreases the amount of re-invitations. You can re-invite respondents. This is technically an option, and if your screening requirements do change, it is something that you can consider. But as I believe Amanda mentioned earlier, it is not a great option, and it should be your last resort. And the reason why it's not a great option, both for your study and for the panel, is because only about 50% of respondents will return to a survey via re-invitation. So immediately you are cutting your prospective response rate right in half. And as Amanda walked through earlier, that has drastic impacts on our overall feasibility. Another thing that this does, and another tip I would have, is only ever re-invite respondents if you believe they will qualify under your new criteria. So if we have properly set up the ordering of our screening questions, which Jana walked us through, and placed those perhaps ones that we knew we might be able to be flexible around towards the end of the screening of the screener, then we should have an idea as to that individual's overall background and their qualifications. So if we place those hard screening questions that we might be flexible on early on in the screening in the screener, then we might actually have to screen them out again because we didn't already ask them that question, if that makes sense. So only ever re-invite them once, because the very last thing we ever want to do is to screen them out 3 times. So that would be a huge no. And then finally, do consider offering an additional incentive if you are asking a respondent to retake the screener. Hopefully you can implement technological solutions within your survey that will reinsert a respondent where they left off. But if that's not the case, I would certainly consider offering that additional incentive. And then finally, one thing that I want to remind everyone, and this is something that I always remind our new researchers at Putnam, is that when a panelist does reach out during the course of fielding, and it does happen from time to time, respond to them as if you're responding to a client, because they are that important. I try not to come down too hard on my novice researchers at Putnam if they make market research errors, but this is one where I get very upset if they do not respond to panelists who have questions, whether it's about incentive processing or accessing the link. Really, respondents, what they want is the same courtesy that they provide us. If they respond to our invitations, we should respond to their emails. So what I tell my colleagues is to be sure to have a process in place where you can respond within 24 hours of contact, even if you don't have an answer to their question. And then finally, being transparent about timelines and expectations, just like we would with a client. And then finally, being ready to give them a bit of a market research lesson as to explaining why they were disqualified and why that doesn't necessarily equate to being unqualified. There you go.
And with that, we will pass it back to Heidi to walk through the key takeaways.
Hi, everybody. So thank you for that information. That was really great. We've gotten some comments from the team here, the attendees, that it was a really good presentation. So if you guys have any questions that you want to pose to our panelists, please do that now. So the key takeaways. So for incidence awareness, we want to define and clarify the project incidents as accurately as possible at the project initiation and seek assistance from the recruiters if you're unsure. You also want to create a contingency plan if the incidence is lower than intended, either at a project initiation or during the early stages of field. And then for sampling considerations, you want to make sure that the universe size of the population impacts that feasibility. Make sure to consider the universe size when creating the sampling plan. You want to work with your country partners to take into consideration the cultural nuances in the screener and the study materials. When you're creating the screener, avoid unnecessary questions that don't impact the qualification into the study. Rank questions in terms of importance. And if available, test your screener out in a pulse, pilot, pretest, or soft launch sample to review screening criteria for adjustments early in the process. And then carefully review the results of the soft launch data for potential issues in feasibility and timeline. And response rate to invitations drops significantly after that first termination and can drop response rate for future studies. So consider screening respondents fully or grouping terminates to ensure re-invites fully qualify the second time.